The Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation is an independent, non-governmental organization established in South Africa in 1989. We are a multidisciplinary institute that seeks to understand and prevent violence, heal its effects, and build sustainable peace at community, national, and regional levels. We do this through collaborating with and learning from the lived and diverse experiences of communities affected by violence and conflict. Through our research, intervention, and advocacy, we seek to enhance state accountability, promote gender equality, build social cohesion, integration, and active citizenship. Based in South Africa, we work across the African continent with communities, civil society, state, and international partners. We provide trauma counseling and mental health support to victims of violence, trauma, and torture at our trauma clinics based in Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Marikana. We work in communities with the aim of fostering empowerment, promoting resilience, and healing the effects of violence. Through interventions such as the Psychosocial Wellness Program, we encourage victims to explore the ecological impact of trauma on their lives. The purpose of our work is to help victims develop coping skills, sense of agency, and promote healing. We as an NGO strive not only to do, but to share what is learned from working on the ground with victims, to capacitate those who are providing psychosocial support to victims in active and post-conflict zones across the African continent, provide psychosocial skills, training, and capacitating psychosocial supporters on the ground to offer victims aid. We advocate for victims' rights to rehabilitation and provide support to African institutions in post-conflict transitions. The work on the ground continues to shape CSVR's approach to working with victims, as the voices of the victims is prioritized in understanding healing in Africa. Research done by CSVR on understanding the impact of torture, war trauma, and violence on individuals, families, and communities, and the interventions that have been conducted to support them formed the motivation for this symposium, titled Blended Voices. As we call on African voices to speak to a narrative of trauma, we call on African voices to speak to a narrative of healing and resilience.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, fellow colleagues and partners from civil society and the academia, eminent persons in our midst, fellow Africans across various fields and disciplines, our panelists, and all our online participants. On behalf of CSVR Board of Directors, the Executive Director, and the entire organization, I welcome you to the inaugural and the very first edition of the CSVR Symposium series titled Blended Voices, Building an Understanding of Torture, War Trauma, and Violence Through an African Lens. The symposium consists of a series of webinars, which will be hosted monthly until March 2021. It aims to take us on a journey that explores Africa's history of trauma, her trajectory, and how it manifests in our present, in the form of the violence that we see today and repetitive cycles of violence, as well as the strategies for healing collectively as individuals as well. In light of what is currently happening in the continent, in Guinea, Nigeria, Mali, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Cameroon, this symposium is timely, and it affords us a platform to reflect on our past, examine our present, and work towards achieving a peaceful future which is free of violence. Truly, the aim is not only to highlight the history of trauma and violence and its impact. It also looks into the resilience and the strength of Africa, her innovation, and the ability to preserve her good in the face of adversity. We call upon your expertise from your various professional fields, as well as the experiences that you have, so that we can shape our personal and collective narratives. And I invite you to draw from these experiences to share with us your ideas on how we can achieve individual and collective healing, as well as to disrupt the cycle of violence and transgenerational trauma that has been carried through from our past. And we also need to build the resilience of the continent and from all the individuals as well as the communities in the continent and in the diaspora. Let us all join our individual voices, to create a powerful collective, a blended voice that will speak on healing from the legacies of the past and ensuring the realization of sustainable peace for all. Guiding us through this journey to help shape the discussion in a meaningful way, we will be having a variety of experts who will be sharing their rich knowledge and experiences with all of us. As CSVR, our heartfelt gratitude to all the professionals who made themselves available this afternoon to present in this symposium. Manfundo Mungapi, who will be speaking on violence and woundedness in Africa. Steve Rebello will be speaking on post-colonial dictatorship in Africa. Kelly Moyo will speak on the transgenerational effects of genocide, drawing from a case study of Kukurahundi, and Tandaisha Tlou will illuminate the issue of violence and the truth about torture in Zimbabwe. Finally, we would like to thank our donors, the Danish Institute Against Torture, Dignity, and the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, without whose support, we would not be able to host this platform or even conduct the work that we do in communities with the survivors of torture, collective violence, urban violence, and war trauma. The symposium will be recorded so that it will be shared with anyone who would need to have it and who are not able to attend this webinar. Today's session of the symposium, which is the very first of the series, will be moderated by the dearest friend of CSVR, Angie Yoda Maina. Angie Yoda Maina is the executive director of the Kenyan NGO, Green String Network, GSN, based in Nairobi. As CSVR, we take pride in our association with GSN, whose programs are aimed at breaking the cycle of violence and victimhood, which has become a norm in context where GSN is operating. It further facilitates social reconciliation by creating opportunities for people and local communities in Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, to learn about the effects of trauma, facilitate healing by planning collective community-wide activities and structures for sustainable healing and reconciliation. NGO Angie Yoda-Minor obtained her Bachelor of Arts in Peace Studies and Political Science from Manchester University, North Manchester in the USA in 1994. She holds a Master's of Arts in Public and Social Policy with the focus on conflict resolution, peace studies from Deakin University. Couldn't we get an appropriate person to moderate this webinar? Angie has recently completed her doctoral studies in applied conflict transformation studies at the doctoral, in applied conflict transformation studies doctoral at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies in the Siem Reap, Cambodia. And her thesis is titled Well-Being and Resilience, a grounded theory using trauma-informed lens for healing-centered peace-building approach. She continues to use or to apply learnings from her research in the countries where GSN is working. Fellows, circumstances may keep us physically miles apart, but we are one in mind, aspirations, and vision. The CSVR Executive Board of Directors wishes you a fruitful engagement. We are not only saying feel at home, but we are saying be at home, literally and figuratively. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Angie Yodermina. I'm happy to be supporting this. I'd like to turn over and we do a short theme video of the theme that we're going to do today, which is a traumatized Africa, a history of torture and trauma on our continent. So I'll turn it back over to the small video.
To understand Africa today, one has to understand its long history. Unfortunately, it is a history in which violence is a dominant feature. Africa's relationship to violence, war, and torture spans across time, dating back hundreds of years to a time of slave trade in which African bodies were seen as a commodity. With the advent of colonialism, a process of de-Africanization began, as the colonizers felt it was their right to civilize the African, according to their standards, disregarding African culture and indigenous knowledge. Thus, taking ownership of our land and our body was done with cruelty and violence, noted in Africa's stories of massacres, genocides, torture, and systematic elimination of the African identity. Violence begets violence. As Africa's story unfolds, we find that Africa's struggle for liberation reverts back to the call for violence, to enact change, to gain power. With the end of colonial rule and the dawn of independence, we find that the war in Africa is not over. The enemy has a new face, at times a familiar face. Violence continues to be used to exert power over the other, to maintain power over the other which is seen as vulnerable, inferior, powerless. The impact of this on communities of Africa has been a true tragedy. The trauma has left scars both visible and invisible, as millions of people are displaced, face poverty, and lack of access to basic needs. Children are born in war, haunted by memories of running and hiding, witnessing pain and death, having to leave their homes, unsure whether their family members are dead or alive. This impact of the past on the present is like ghosts lurking in the shadows, ghosts that continue to impact the psyche of Africa today, as years of trauma has shattered Africa's sense of self, sense of worth, and further fragmented us as a people. Today's webinar reflects on this history and the stories of Africa, so that we can begin to understand, reflecting on the psychological and the social landscape that Africa sits with today, following years of violence and trauma. It is also through these stories that we can remember that we are a people of Africa. We are people of resilience.
So I think we'll get started. It's exciting to see all the names of the attendees out there all over the continent, joining us from other places outside of Africa. Welcome to everyone. This is a really exciting symposium that will feature a 6-part webinar from now until March next year. One time a month that we'll be gathering. I look forward to each of these sessions where we're going to start to explore Africa's relationship to torture, war trauma, violence, which expands, as we've just seen from the short video, through the history of slavery, the pre-colonial phases, the colonial, the post-colonial violence. It's going to help us explore issues around the current civil wars, the current unrest that we've just actually been also reminded of, tribal and ethnic and political, cultural, social conflict that is actually present from much of the past. The symposium will aim to explore this history and how it shaped Africa, but I also see from the names of those who are attending, we're also going to highlight and showcase Africa's creativity and innovation in engaging with these complex issues. We have a lot to learn from each other, but I also think that we have a lot to teach from the continent to the rest of the world. And I hope that the symposium becomes a way to kickstart that interchange, but also the ability to share a lot of the really amazing and things that are happening right now. Last night, as I was starting to think about this, I started to think about how we're not complete until we understand our wounds. Once we realize that we're wounded, then we can start that intentional process of healing. But not only individual healing as often is the focus in the West with mental health practices, but in Africa's case, I think it's critical that we include collective and social healing as well. Our history of pain and chronic violence is collective and social, and thus our healing must also undertake this. Healing must be the same if it's also going to have the impact of being able to reclaim what has happened to us for centuries. This symposium will be covering some very difficult subjects. If during the webinar you feel triggered, stand up, you're on Zoom, we can't see you, get a drink of water, do some stretches, do some deep breathing, come back to it when you're ready. But CSVR is also offering debriefing support, and we'll put it into the chat, how you can reach out for any kind of debriefing support that you feel you need from being able to participate in this symposium today. So we're going to get started. We have 4 amazing speakers. Our keynote speaker will be starting today, and then we'll have another 3 who will be sharing their research and their work on this subject of Traumatized Africa, a history for torture and trauma on our continent. So I'm really happy to present our first keynote speaker, Manfundo Mungapi. I have admired her work in Southern Africa for a decade. I've been following, I've been understanding, we've connected on Twitter and other places. She is currently the executive director for the Center of the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. She has over 16 years of experience in senior leadership and management. Previously, she worked as the head of the psychosocial intervention at CSVR and as the director for South Africa's Institute for Traumatic Stress. She's the exact person that we want to actually have talk today. She was also employed as a clinical psychologist and a community liaison officer at a trauma clinic where she offered psychosocial support, including counseling, group therapy, and community intervention to the survivors of political and violent crime. Her areas of expertise include integrating psychosocial expertise within policy and programming on a wide range of issues, including leadership, human rights, peace building, governance, democracy, and transitional justice. One of the things I always take away from when I hear her talking is about her passion when she speaks about the wounded leaders and what we need to do for the healing for our leadership, not only in South Africa, but across the entire continent. She has a passion for providing and understanding the psychosocial healing of individuals, institutions, and also our collective space. She's used this to contribute to shaping regional policies like the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights, the General Comment on the Redress of Victims of Torture, and to provide capacity building to a range of groups, including leaders and managers within the health and the education sector. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Manfundo today, and we really look forward to what you have to bring to us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you very much. It is such an honor for me to be here to talk to something that is very, very close to my heart. And just thank you to the CSVR team for the video that you have prepared. When we are just watching it, it just has depicted in pictures and in very powerful way some of the stuff that I want to talk about today. Welcome to everyone that is here. I can also see familiar people we've been talking with about such issues, and it is an excitement that finally we are here where we have a symposium, we're sitting together and we are talking about these issues. So my focus today is going to be looking at what I call a traumatized Africa and understanding this wounded context and implication for its intervention. For us to understand this and its importance, for the longest time when I started working at CSVR, working with issues of peace building, violence prevention, torture, human rights. I had this unsettling, this uncomfortability that I had around what was happening in our continent. But I didn't have the language to assist in describing what that was. And in 2017, when we were launching our violence against women study, Miss Aine Gituku Shongwe, so we've got a connection between her and she's now a South African, but also from Kenya, said something that was really powerful. And she said that one of the issues that they are struggling with around SGPV, which I think applies in a number of areas in our continent, was what she called the paradox. And the paradox was that despite the increased investment in institutions and in legal frameworks, SGPV was increasing. For me, that just made so much sense, because as an organization that has been working with these very same issues of development and peace building and human rights in South Africa and across the continent for the past 30 years, we have been amazed at how, despite all these investments that we have, policies, programming, I mean, we have invested in institutions, we have trained people, most of us have been in this field for decades. But we have this paradox that despite all these investments, it's almost as if we are getting the opposite. Conflict is on the increase. You just have to see what's happening currently in Nigeria, in Guinea, and in a number of countries that our board member, Dr. Maisela, mentioned. Increase in GPV, gross human rights violations, and corruption. So for me, what I want to argue today is that one of the key contributors of this paradox is really the lack of appreciation in the continent. I don't think we have fully appreciated the nature, just how deep this wounding goes, the extent, the number of areas that it has impacted, and the depth of this wounding. And because we have not appreciated this as a continent, when we come to bring in various programs to advance Africa and ensure that it thrives, ensure that, as the AU will say, we're building the Africa that we want, a number of our development project, violence prevention, peace building, reconciliation programs, when we bring them, we usually do not appreciate the role that woundedness can actually play. And you will see, I don't use trauma, I use woundedness, and I'll explain later why I use that language. We don't fully appreciate just how this woundedness contributes to this paradox, how it interferes and hinders the capacity of these programs to actually be successful and us seeing the fruits to our investment. So I want to argue today, as we open this symposium, that we really have a big task ahead of us. Those of us who are practitioners that are working with issues of violence, working with issues of trauma, but those of us who are policymakers, programmers that are interested in the success of Africa. We need to begin to understand this woundedness, and I will touch on that a bit more, so that we can appreciate why is it that we are struggling like this as a continent? Why are we having this paradox? And we can then begin to appreciate the investment that is needed. Because for the longest time in the continent, people come and invest on things that can be easily projectified, as I say. And sometimes I say things that can be lawyerized, you know, the rights and all of that, because trauma is too messy, is too unclear, is too massive. How do you measure it? And I think that has happened at the demise of us as Africans. So I'm hoping that we can begin to say, how do we capture a language that can make us understand that if we do not invest in dealing with our wounding, it is actually going to cost us more. And hopefully I will touch a bit more on some of the strategies. So if we understand this wounding, we appreciate why we are struggling in the investment, then we can begin to shift the way in which we respond to the challenges that we have in our context. And I think one of the challenges that we have as practitioners who I think that are critical in addressing this paradox. I don't see how we address this paradox in Africa without pulling us in as the people that work with issues of wounding and trauma. The first thing that we have to do, and I really learned this language when in 2008, when we had the first incidents of xenophobic violence in South Africa. And I remember standing there and watching the television, and it seems like exactly what I experienced as a teenager and the kind of violence that I experienced was unfolding in front of me. And I just knew somehow that the kind of violence I was seeing was psychological. And I went back to the office. I was the manager then of the trauma clinic, and the media called us and said, you work with trauma, explain what is happening. And actually I did not have the language, because my training on trauma was mainly the medical training that focuses one-on-one. I was a trained clinical psychologist, had been working for 8 years in the field of trauma, but I could not take my knowledge of trauma and translate it in helping our country to understand the violence that we were seeing that was related to xenophobic violence. And that's really when I started understanding, and this is our challenge as the practitioners, how do we expand our knowledge and understanding of trauma so that it is able to speak to the larger societal and collective processes that Africa is facing. And secondly, I can never forget this. I met this guy who wrote a very good book on dealing with the past, which was on transitional justice. And when I read that book, it made so much sense for me because I saw trauma written everywhere. But when I sat and I talked to him and I said, you know, your book is really good, and I think you have to consider integrating trauma in transitional justice. The minute I said trauma, he closed off and he said, no, we don't deal with trauma. You can talk to the World Health Organization. So over the years, in the past decade, I then had to learn to find a language that resonates with policymakers, with programmers, with leaders, the people that are at the forefront of creating change in our continent, but they are busy creating more problems because they are not aware of woundedness. So the issue of language and how do we begin to speak a language that is understandable is also a challenge for us. And of course, how do we work together as the people in the field towards doing this? And how do we work with people who are practitioners that are not in the trauma field? How do we go to people that are doing economic development and say you are a practitioner in economic development, but you can't go to a traumatized society and implement this without integrating trauma? So we have to begin to look into that. One of the challenges, of course, I just want to say it in advance, is finding the right language. I know that Prof. Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela is doing a lot of work in this in Stellenbosch and has pulled us a CSVR to work with her to begin to say what is the right language to express what I'm talking about here. And people have used cultural trauma, social trauma, historical trauma, but I'm really hoping that as a field, and I constantly say to people that it is the practitioners in Africa who understand the collective nature of our trauma. And if any theory, a robust theory that is going to make a difference is to come out, it will have to come out of Africa. So we really have to begin to have a shared language of how we describe this. Other people call it psychosocial trauma. I prefer the concept of collective trauma when I talk about it. But recently, when we went to our communities and we asked them, what is their description of trauma? They said for them, trauma means inxeba lenhliziyo. Inxeba lenhliziyo. I just like saying my clicks, my Xhosa clicks to all our friends in Southern Africa. But for me, inxeba lenhliziyo meant the wound of the heart. And I found that as we go into communities and we talk about woundedness, it seems to resonate more for them than trauma. So you'll hear me using this concept of woundedness, which can be interchanged with the concept of trauma for those of you who are trained in the medical. So what I'm hoping to do in the next few minutes that I have, and there's no way that I can comprehensively address this, but I want to touch a bit more in what is it that we need to understand about this collective trauma and wounding. Remembering that my purpose is that by the time I am done here, I want to convince us that we have to start engaging with this in order to shift the larger processes in our continent. And I'm going to look at understanding what it is, how does it show up, and then what the implications are in terms of how we can begin to intervene. So some of you are already scholars here, but in case we don't have the same, to make sure that we all have the same understanding, I want to just touch briefly some of the understanding within the collective trauma studies, or what I call collective wounding, that there is definitely a difference between individual traumatization, which has personal effect, mass experiences of trauma, where people experience large experiences such as earthquake, but people suffer along each other. Their suffering is individualized and is not felt as shared. When we talk about collective trauma, it's really when the event enters the territory of being shared, and when that event begins to shape the tangible social forms of how we engage with each other, how we talk with each other. That's when we talk about collective trauma. It interferes with social projects that we are trying to bring in our continent. And the studies in collective trauma shows that just as much as individuals can actually show defenses once they've been exposed to trauma at a collective level. And I've done a lot of traveling through my work on transitional justice at CSVR. And every time when I travel and I enter into a country, the first thing that I do, some of you that I have met in your countries, you'll know, I ask you about the history of that country. But I also observe the people, I observe how they interact with each other. And I can tell from how they deal with issues, how they interact with issues, the nature of the collective trauma that society is holding. So collective trauma theory argues that some of the social defenses you will see is depersonalization. How many of us in our society have this sense where we treat people as less than, as just numbers, and not as true human beings? Detachments, people in hospitals become just a number, not human beings that we connect with. Denial of feeling. I mean, I see this in South Africa. People who have money, and you will go and see poor people who don't have food to eat. And yet we go on and we survive and it doesn't touch us. That's a social defense. Ritualized task performance, doing the same thing over and over, even if it doesn't work and even if it creates more problems. Bringing the same solutions that actually are not solving, because you don't have the capacity to engage with the trauma and therefore the reality of what you are facing. Redistribution of responsibility. Not taking responsibility for what you've done, being able to say, yes, I'm sorry, I take responsibility, I will shift it, but rather redistributing it to others. And of course, the sense that, you know, every leader we have, we idealize, oh, this president is going to solve our problem, this leader is going to solve our problems. Either we idealize people or we completely devalue them. And of course, avoidance of change. And if you study trauma, of course, there is specific description of how this really shows up. But what I like with collective trauma is that you can take these and show people and show how these show up at a collective level in their organization and in their institutions and how trauma stands in the way. You can also have manifestations of collective trauma. I will not go into details because I also have to look at our time. But studies show that some of the manifestations of trauma at a collective level, and we see this in our continent, right, is the fixation with a traumatic experience. For example, in South Africa, we are so fixated. The minute you talk about race and apartheid, we become paralyzed and we begin to fight and we become even more divided. So that unresolved trauma, that chosen trauma begins to shape our reaction to life unless it is dealt with. In other countries, it is around ethnicity. In other countries, it's around religion and conflicts that are related to that. Public discourse really becomes distorted. There is no sense of social contract, the capacity to say, how do we come together as a society and solve the problems that we need to solve? And of course, the basic building blocks. I get surprised how developmental agencies, and I've been talking to some of them, still come in and say to us, oh, we're going to implement these programs in communities. And we're like, but this is a traumatized society. The building blocks that define communities are broken. There's no way you can come in and do a developmental program, whether it's renewable energy, whatever it is, without dealing with the trauma that divides societies. Actually, you will create more problems. And I like this one. What happens is that when We have been traumatized at a collective level, as a society, as a continent, as an organization. When we have unmet needs, they take intensity in terms of their desperation. So a lot of people have said, but I mean, we know that you are hungry, but why would you shoot a person if you are hungry? But it's because the hunger represents the unresolved trauma that I have. Okay, so I just want to then move to implications of these for collective trauma or woundedness. And I just want to, and then I will touch on some of the strategies that I want to talk about. But I think for me, then the implications of this, looking at what I've presented, but also the video that we've just presented here, we have to begin every time when we come to do things in our communities, in our societies, say we are operating in wounded context with wounded individuals, institutions, societies, where we are likely to have wounded leaders. How do we take this into consideration? And this wound that we are talking about, I really am amazed at how asleep we are as a continent to how deep this wound is. It hits us at a personal level, at a collective level, at a historical level. Now, here's the thing about the historical wound. And some of the work that I do with leaders and managers, I experience a lot of leaders who say that they are in toxic environments because they feel disrespected. But when they feel disrespected, even by maybe their employee, the intensity of their response causes toxicity. We see it also even in our political leaders. But the reason why there is such an intense response is that when I stand as Manfundo and I feel disrespected, I represent not just my pain, I represent my mother's unresolved pain, my grandmother's unresolved pain, my great-great-mother's unresolved pain. That is, of course, now also registered in my body. That's the intensity of my reaction to these issues. And unless we really understand how deeply entrenched this is, we will not appreciate why we need to shift it. It is transgenerational and it is embedded in our structures. So no matter how much work we do in development, policing, youth violence, peace building, human rights, these will hit against this traumatization. Unless we integrate this healing and woundedness, we are not going to struggle in ensuring that we have the kind of a continent that we want. And we're going to have people that are not able to take up some of these developmental opportunities, leaders that sabotage the very same work they are trying to do, and institutions that are dysfunctional, and a society and a continent. How many plans? I mean, I work with the AU. We work with the AU at CSVR. If you go inside the AU machinery, they've got excellent policies, excellent plans, but they are not working because the institution is so, it represents the wounding, and they are so dysfunctional and unable to produce that. So we can design all these institutions, but unless we come in as trauma practitioners and give our inputs, we're not going to be able to make it. Angie, you just please have to tell me when it's 5 minutes left. So just quick, then going to some of the implications. So these are things that you know, this is the work that you do, but I just want to come in and saying, if we then understand this wounded context, how do we come back and work differently with these issues? The first thing is, I really believe we need a cultural shift in a society to understand that individual work is not just for victims. Because a lot of donors and people come to us and saying, and what is even a victim in this continent? Because I am also a victim of the traumatization, and I see how some of my coping mechanisms stand in the way of how I am as a person, as a leader, and as a practitioner. There is an important work of awakening in this continent, where we really become awake to our wounds and how they are standing in the way, where we have to raise an awareness around the necessity of healing as an important next struggle for the continent. And saying that if you are an African, and if you are a South African, if you are a Kenyan, if you are a Rwandan, wherever you come from, if you understand that you come from wounded context, then you have to know that it has to be our generation that breaks this wounding. And therefore, an integral part of our work has to be to deal with our wounding. We have to look at engaging with families. We know this. We know this. Hurting people hurt others. We understand all of this, that for people to thrive, they need to be in unconditional caring environments. But we have the level of wounding. So in some of the work that we do, we go and ask people to write their rivers of life. I am amazed at the pain that has been translated. So our collective woundedness has been translated into the family unit, whatever it is. And that's where the initial wounding takes place. So how do we begin to bring healing within those institutions so that Africa can be able to produce people that are not wounded, but that can thrive? How do we transform our institutions? The level of toxicity in these institutions, I don't think we understand the importance of transforming the organizational culture within the institutions in our continent. This is something that's very close to my heart. I won't go into details because those that have worked with me actually know. Sorry, I have people outside the streets that are just screaming. Guys, as long as we as leaders and as managers are wounded, we are going to have an Africa that is driven by the wounding rather than the visions that we actually developed. We are going to have a continent where we are unable to deal with these many challenges that we have. Actually, we will take these challenges and create even more problem and conflict. So the issue of leadership, I always say to people, the first place to intervene is the area of dealing with wounding. I've spoken other places that in this context, you can have peace carriers whose leaders that have dealt with their wound, or trauma carriers who actually make things worse. I can come back if you have more details on this because I've talked so much about it in other platforms. And finally, in conclusion, I want to talk to us as practitioners in the field and as trauma people. The other day I was talking to lawyers in the TJ field, but we have to understand this, that one of the greatest risks for us is chronic stress and burnout. And because the wound is so deep, if we do not deal with ourselves, and COVID has just complicated it, that self-care is an integral part of our work. And that we have to appreciate the reality that we work and we will continue to work with wounded people. We will help wounded people. We will manage wounded people and will be managed by wounded people, and we will work in wounded contexts. So how do we build our own resilience so that this woundedness does not infiltrate our psyche and impact our own ability to do the work? I am amazed at how we know the theory as practitioners, but we don't do the practice because we have grown up in a society that is not used to doing this. We need to have research, invest in really documenting best practice, start developing this theoretical construct of what does it mean to work in a wounded context? What does it mean to be leaders in wounded contexts, and how do we begin to shift Africa so that this can inform the policies and the programming that we have in our continent? I like what Bloom says, who really influenced and informed a lot of my work on collective trauma. She says, if the trauma remains untreated, if the wounding is untransformed, then history will keep on repeating itself. And every time it does, the cost is higher. Isn't this what is happening in our continent? Isn't this the picture that we were just shown in that video? That the face of the perpetrators has changed, but we are seeing the history of violation repeating itself over and over in our continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfundo. We were all a little bit uncertain because we got so deep
في
into
غاية
it.
الامتنان استماعا إلى ما قلتيه نمفندو.
And so that
إذن
for some reason the Arabic has come on as the main cornerstone.
أعتقد أنه أحد الجوانب التي استمعنا إلى
I don't know if we want to fix that before we go on.
Yes, just give me a second.
Okay, there we go. Are you ready?
We can just try now.
Manfundo, thank you so much for entering with Sandra Bloom and her conversation about transformation, because oftentimes when we talk about the woundedness, the trauma, we end there and we don't take it to the next part of what we're going to do and how we can come out of this woundedness. I'd like to turn us over now to the next speaker. The next speaker is Stephen Rebello. He is a senior researcher at the Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation. He's also a counseling psychologist based in Johannesburg. He's been contributing to the development of CSVR's integrated model of working with communities, as well as guidelines for clinical work with migrant families, African families, who've been affected by the complex and the continuous trauma that they found in their lives. Stephen's research interests include ecological and critical approaches to understanding the challenges, such as economic inequality, youth exclusion, and violence. So we'll welcome you, Stephen. And if we could get you to give us the presentation, there we go. Welcome, and I'll give you 20 minutes.
Thanks so much, Angie, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Manfundo for sharing. I think that the links between Manfundo's presentation and mine are definitely clear, and I hope to kind of accentuate some of those links through this presentation. So I think the first thing to start off is this is just a topic of interest for me. I'm by no means a subject expert. I realize with centuries worth of violence on the continent, as has already been suggested, this would require years of research to be a subject expert in it. So recognize the contested nature of history, and it's really history, who writes history, and history for who and for whom. So I already recognize this contested nature of history. And at the same time, the same thing is true of African history. And this discussion is made even more sensitive by my position as a young white male. Or I'm not sure which of those are more relevant. Is it a white young male or a white male young? But all three of those factors have an influence. But at the same time, I think the aim of my presentation is to generate further discussion on this topic, and potentially, try break some of the colonial and racist discourse that Africans, just are inherently violent. And I think that is not just held outside of Africa, but through my conversations with colleagues and with people that we come into contact with as clients, this kind of discourse has still been internalized. And Frans Fanon is someone who's also spoken to this as well. So what is the definition of a dictator? I think there are different understandings of what a dictator means, and it's quite a complicated definition. In this presentation, I take the basic definition of a dictator is someone or political leaders or heads of states who utilize various forms of violence to seize or maintain power, control, and order over citizens, institutions, and resources. Some might see violence as legitimate and others might see violence as illegitimate. For example, the use of violence against terrorists or armed groups who threaten a country's stability. Some might see terrorists as terrorists, others might see them as freedom fighters. And so that's just to consider, violence, depending on our position, it is so subjective. Definition would also include leaders who are perhaps not synonymous with the use of physical violence. So I think we as the CSVR would recognize that you don't need to be physically violent to be violent. We know about structural violence. We know that laws can be violent and just as devastating. And for example, corruption is just another form of violence that I think would add to the definition of a dictator. So in this presentation, I'll be taking an ecological approach to dictatorship. And the ecological approach is really thinking about the factors at various levels over time that contribute to behaviors. And if the macro system includes societal level factors, then with the onset of global exploitation, there is a need to recognize factors beyond the societal level. So it's not just as a South African society, that's not where we need to stop looking. We need to look at the regional level, at the international, even the global level. What are the factors that kind of drive and maintain dictatorships? I think focusing on each level is beyond the scope of this presentation. And I think if we can keep Manfundo's presentation in mind, that I think really covers the intrapsychic, the individual levels, all the way up to the meso system or the exosystem, as you can see in that picture or present in that kind of figure over there. I think this presentation also focuses on certain factors at the chrono, and I'm not sure what is actually, well, the chrono system is really factors over time that contribute to certain behaviors. And above the macro system, I'm not sure what that's called, but I think it's kind of just the global system or the supra system maybe. So I also think there's a need for a balanced approach or a balanced understanding of dictatorship. Something that I've noticed in some of the reading that I did is you can either get Afrocentric or Eurocentric views of dictatorship. And these views tend to focus on different levels. So an Afrocentric view would view dictatorship as a colonial creation or the result of colonial influence. So maybe the macro level, versus dictatorship as being more inherent, which is more Eurocentric view. So the individual through to the meso level. Dictatorship is just kind of something that you associate with a certain group of people. So in thinking about the chrono system in time, the question that I posed to myself is, were pre-European forms of leadership free from violence or coercion in Africa? And I know that I potentially create a lot of conflict by bringing this up, but it's to also recognize that pre-European slavery, there was actually slave ownership in Africa before Europeans arrived. And I know that it can bring up strong reactions from different people, but there is evidence to suggest that slavery in North Africa was kind of already established in 500 AD. So I think it's difficult to acknowledge, but it's to kind of try and have this balanced approach to understanding dictatorship and violence in leadership. Colonialists so undoubtedly influenced social structures, and they enforced their own social structures or arrangements to suit their political, economic, social interests. Just mentioning the point that I've just mentioned, we also can't deny the effects of colonialism as well. As has already been mentioned in the presentation, the transatlantic slave trade, which started in the early 1500s, going up until probably the late 1800s, I think we need to try and understand the effects of this, as Manfundo and others have mentioned. And the countries that I'm presenting on today were particularly affected by the slave trade as well. I think when thinking about dictatorship, obviously we need to understand the effects of the colonial era rule and exploitation, and how did this contribute to post-colonial dictatorship. At the same time, different models of colonial rule contributed to different psychological effects. So obviously all colonialists viewed themselves as superior and Africans or the colonized as inferior. The extent of identity annihilation was also tied to models of colonial rule. So for example, Belgian, Portuguese and English models of colonialism had much worse effects than Spanish rule. And there's some research that has kind of made that suggestion. Belgian rule, I think, is viewed as kind of having the strongest breakdown on forms of existing leadership. Existing forms of leadership were replaced with direct rule, like what's described as a very paternalistic form of rule. And the Belgians just had very blunt economic interests. That's kind of why they were here, kind of no other real outcomes besides just extracting as much resources as they could. I think the French in North Africa can be accused of the same as well. So obviously, also understanding Belgian rule and how it's affected leadership is we had very highly centralized forms of leadership during the colonial era. And in some ways, these autocratic forms of rule were passed down from the colonial era into the post-colonial era. British indirect rule through traditional leadership structures. The British, in contrast to the Belgians, they try to also accentuate cultural differences. The whole concept of divide and conquer. They also try to accentuate or create divisions of labor across ethnic or cultural lines and create ethnic hierarchies. This is a way of kind of turning the gaze from themselves, turning frustrations and turning anger towards other groups. Obviously, also Frantz Fanon is someone who has spoken about this identity annihilation and the effects of oppression on the oppressed as well. In thinking about dictatorship, I think it's so important to think about power vacuums. And obviously, we kind of all know that in the transition to political independence, there's often these power vacuums that occurred. We also need to consider the global political context in the 1960s, which was a time when many African countries were achieving independence. And for me, there's just so many examples that I could turn to try and discuss this dictatorship. For me, I chose to focus on the DRC just because in the clinic, a large number of clients that we work with are from the DRC. And for myself personally, I wanted to try and get a better understanding of the country's political background and some of the factors that might contribute to conflict and dictatorship in the country. Just trying to watch my time. I think I've already used, how many minutes have I used? Have I used 15 minutes already?
You're at about 15, you're at about 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna have to go very quickly. So I think moving forward is obviously in the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo, we all kind of had an understanding of King Leopold II and the way that he kind of ruled over the Orange Free State, or not the Orange Free State, the Congo Free State. And he's notorious for the levels of economic exploitation and violence that he used in the country. Up to potentially 15 million Congolese died due to living conditions, working conditions, disease, torture, and violence in the space of 2 decades. We also need to recognize already existing US economic interests in the country. So in the DRC's transition to independence, the first democratically elected leader was Patrice Lumumba. And soon after he comes into power, there's the almost immediate Congo crisis. The Katanga province, which is a mineral-rich province, there's a succession movement that happens shortly after he comes into power. Lumumba and Kasavuba kind of appeal to the US for support to deal with this succession movement. That is kind of pushed back by President Eisenhower. He doesn't offer that support. So Lumumba then kind of appeals to the United Nations for support. And then after the United Nations' apparent refusal to support Lumumba, there's apparent lack of support in doing that. But an interesting article that I read suggests that there actually wasn't a refusal. It was more just a refusal to use force to deal with the Katanga successionist movement. So Lumumba then obviously turns to the Soviet Union for support, an action which wasn't supported by his counterparts. Mobutu, who then kind of was the commander of the army at the time, takes advantage of this impasse, and there's a military coup, and he creates a new government, which then lasts for just over 3 decades. Lumumba is taken captive, violently tortured, and executed in 1961. So in this presentation, I was trying to consciously attempt to leave out certain points to paint this familiar narrative of African politics, where it's just political instability, you have a coup and then, some stability. But when we actually look at the international level, we see a much more complicated picture of the narrative. The DRC's political independence is happening at a time of immense global geopolitical and ideological tension. So Cold War is happening around this time. Many African countries are considering the different ideologies they would like to use and different ideologies that would run, that used to run their countries. And for the Americans, obviously there's this potential threats of the Soviet Union having a stronger influence on the continent. So it's very interesting to see that actually the CIA was involved in a plot to kill Lumumba. But there were also multiple actors who wanted to do the same thing. There were suggestions that Lumumba's refusal to support the US economic interests kind of contributed to their kind of attempts to assassinate him. But also recognizing the Katanga secessionist movement was supported by white colonial era interests. So the Belgian, US, British, and even Southern African heads of state were supporting this secessionist movement. There was also suggestions that the US used uranium from the Congo for their atomic bombs that they used in World War II. And they're obviously very worried about the Soviet Union's gaining control of this resource. So again, if we're thinking about the individual level factors, we're thinking about trauma, I think this is all important. But I think as people living on the continent or as Africans, we need to really think about the role of international actors and global factors that contribute to dictatorship. So Mobutu was supported by the US and the CIA. He was the preferred candidate for leadership in the Congo. And as a leading academic in the Congo was saying, that's because it's so much easier to maintain your economic interests when you have a corrupt leader in charge. If you have someone that has values that are aligned with democracy, it's much more difficult to kind of get what you need from that leader. So in the post-colonial era, we really need to consider how global political and economic interests support dictatorship. My last two slides, I apologize to the interpreters for having to go so fast, is we need to recognize the issue of dictatorship is a really complex problem. And we need to understand multiple factors over time that have contributed to the brutal dictatorships that we have witnessed. As I mentioned, we need to consider the international global level factors that contributed to Patrice Lumumba's execution. And we also need to think how these factors are still playing out at this point in time. We also cannot neglect the intrapsychic through to macro level factors. They are definitely still important. My last slide is really thinking, well, what do we do about all of this? How should local, regional, and international actors respond to contested elections? So we can see this, it's playing out in, I think in Nigeria, or it's playing out in Guinea right now, is what do we do? If we think about the Gambia, ECOWAS got involved, what was different about that situation? Why is that type of response used there and not used in other situations? How should regional or international actors respond to political violence? Political violence, the use of force, the use of police brutality, how should different actors respond to that? I think we need to really consider the policy of non-interventionism. What does that really mean? When and how do we intervene in instances where political violence is used as a tool to maintain power? Who is most affected by economic sanctions? I think, as we've seen in Algeria and the Arab Spring, is we need to recognize the power of mass, inclusive, peaceful, sustained social action. So we've seen in Zimbabwe, there have been attempts to kind of deal with the political turmoil or just the sheer corruption that's happening there. but the size of the social action is just not strong enough at this moment. And my last point is, how do we deal with neo-colonialism? So the colonial era didn't end. It was replaced by something else, which is multinational organizations and companies who are now the new colonialists. We need to consider not just the West, but the East. We need to think about China and China's role in Africa. Potentially, do we turn to other African countries to be trade partners and to develop Africa? Sorry for the rush presentation, but I thank you for your time.
Sorry, you actually had 16 extra seconds, Steve, so you did actually really well. That's a lot of history to put into a very short time. Sorry about that. So we're going to move on to Kelly Moyo. She is a writer and a human rights defender from Zimbabwe. For the past 4 years, she's been using print, digital, and social media, particularly Twitter, where I just noticed she's an influencer at a very large scale with 50,000 followers, to expose human rights abuses, bad governance, and corruption. Kelly holds honor degrees in geography and environmental studies from the Midland State University in Zimbabwe. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So I only have 20 minutes and I won't waste it on pleasantries. I'm going to talk about the intergenerational effects of Gukurahundi, a genocide that took place in Matabeleland in Zimbabwe between 1983 and 1987. So to introduce this, I'm going to explain how Zimbabwe is generally divided along tribal lines, geographically even. So the provinces in Zimbabwe are where you will find our different ethnicities. So we have the Mashonaland provinces where you will find mostly Shona-speaking individuals. It will be different dialects of Shona, but that is where you find the Shona people of Zimbabwe in all our Mashonaland provinces. Then we have the Matabeleland provinces where you will find the different ethnicities that are identified as being Ndebele, and our being grouped together as Ndebeles also a huge part of Gukurahundi, which we'll be talking about today. So you'll find that in Matabeleland, we have Kalangas, we have the Tonga, we have different ethnicities, but we are generally just known as the Ndebeles of Zimbabwe. Then we have the Manicaland provinces where you find the Manica speaking people. Manica is a dialect of Shona, if I'm not mistaken. And we have the Masvingo provinces where you'll find mostly the Karanga people. Then we have the Midlands, and by definition, I guess it's the middle ground where you'll find a mixture. So in the Midlands, you'll find Ndebeles and Shonas as well. This is important for us to understand because it will help us to understand why the subject we're talking about today is a genocide. So ethnicity basically is how most of us Zimbabweans identify ourselves. So when you meet someone, because of the language that they speak, you'll know where they come from. So I identify myself as a Ndebele person from Matabeleland. And so in 1980, when we had our first elections, after we gained independence from Rhodesia, the country again was divided into two groups: ZAPU supporters, which was mostly the Matabeleland people. ZAPU was led then by Joshua Nkomo, the late. And then we had ZANU supporters who were mostly from Mashonaland, and they were led by Robert Gabriel Mugabe. So you will realize that I am talking about supporters and not necessarily just the parties, because in the parties, we found there were people from different ethnicities, but they are supporters for some reason reason came from different parts of the country, mostly. So when the elections happened in 1980, ZANU won the elections, but they were not satisfied with the victory because ZAPU won almost all the provinces in Matabeleland. And because ZANU-PF, the ZANU-PF ideology is a one-party state, they immediately saw that as the fact that the people from Matabeleland and part of the Midlands had largely voted against ZANU-PF, say to them, there is a problem. So in the runnings of a country, especially a country like Zimbabwe, which depends a lot on state security, the threat is usually identified by the Minister of State Security. And the Minister of State Security at the time, a man called Emmerson Mnangagwa. I'm sure you all know this name because this same person is the president of Zimbabwe now. But then back in 1980, he was the Minister of State Security. And as the Minister of State Security, after the 1980 elections, he identified a threat to the state. And that threat to the state was Ndebeles in Matabeleland and in the Midlands. When he identified this threat, the minister responsible for investigating whether this truly was a threat to state security was a man called Sidney Sekeramai, who was at the time the minister responsible for defense. So he was a minister of state, but his portfolio was, his responsibility was largely defense of the country. So that threat confirmed that indeed Matabeleland and Ndebeles in Matabeleland were a threat to state security because they voted for ZAPU instead of ZANU-PF. The commander-in-chief of the defense forces at the time was the president of the country, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, who also doubled as the minister of defense. So once presented with this threat of Ndebeles by virtue of voting for ZAPU, being a threat to national security and being in the position of destabilizing the country, the commander-in-chief of the defense forces, Robert Mugabe, then deployed the army to deal with this threat, which was Ndebeles in Matabeleland and the Midlands. So to deal with this threat, the government of Zimbabwe decided to train a group, a special group of the army, which was then called the Fifth Brigade. This Fifth Brigade was trained and assembled only to deal with this threat to state security, which was the Ndebeles that were voting for ZAPU instead of ZANU-PF. And this was a threat because ZANU-PF believed that for Zimbabwe to develop, we needed to have a one-party state. And therefore, there was a threat to this one-party state. The threat was ZAPU, and the threat was those people that were voting for ZAPU, the ZAPU supporters. So when these people then trained the Fifth Brigade, a man called Perence Shiri, who goes by so many different names. He was born Big Boy, Samson Shi Kerema, but by the time he died, he was mostly known as Perence Shiri. Perence Shiri was the commander of the Fifth Brigade that was then deployed to the Matabeleland and Midlands provinces to deal with this threat, the Ndebeles. And so there was also one brigade. One brigade was a brigade of the army housed in the province where this mission was going to be carried out. And so the commander of one brigade was the man who is now our vice president, Constantine Chiwenga. So I'm naming these individuals so that we understand how we came to identify a particular ethnic group as a threat to state security and who was responsible for this labeling of an ethnic group as a threat to state security. So with the threat identified and the brigade trained and deployed, They were sent to Matabeleland with one mission only, and that was to eliminate the threat to state security. And this threat was the Ndebele people. So when this brigade went to Matabeleland, they did exactly what they had been sent to do. They attacked all ZAPU supporters viciously, and ZAPU supporters were found in the provinces of Matabeleland and the Midlands, and they were identified by language. So if you talk to people that were there during Gukurahundi, they will tell you that the method used to differentiate the threat and civilians who were not a threat was the language that they spoke. If you could not speak Shona, you were then classified as Ndebele, and therefore you were a threat to state security. So how these people dealt with this threat to state security was through murder. People were murdered at a large scale by shooting, bayoneting. You hear stories of people having been burnt alive in huts, of children being crushed to death. It is so. Murder was the #1 method of dealing with this threat to state security. But that wasn't the only way that they dealt with the threat. They also raped a lot of women in Matabeleland, and rape was used particularly so that more Shona children would be born, because you'll find that the soldiers of the 5th Brigade Army were Shona citizens, because I suppose they realized they would not be able to send Ndebele soldiers to deal with a threat which was Ndebele's. So as part of the attacks, rapes were used systemically, and you find a lot of women were raped and a lot of women got pregnant, and the reason was so that less Ndebele children would be born and more Shona-speaking children would be born who would not be a threat to state security. Aside from the rapes, there was torture. Torture was a huge weapon used against the people of Matabeleland. You hear stories of people having their testicles crushed, and you realize most of the methods were such that the people of Matabeleland were killed, such that the people of Matabeleland would stop reproducing, and that those who continue to reproduce children would only give birth to Shona children. So the males would be taken, beaten up, castrated. Many ways, many methods were used to sterilize the men of Matabeleland. And then we also had enforced disappearances as a weapon. So all this I'm explaining shows clearly that there was a genocide in Matabeleland, and I'll explain why it was a genocide. The convention, the UN Convention on Genocide, describes genocide. I'll read this out so that I make no mistake about this definition. So genocide is described as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, racial, or religious group, and as such, killing members of the group. We saw that happening in Matabeleland, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. That happened in Matabeleland, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And this is exactly what happened in Matabeleland during Gukurahundi, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So this was done in Matabeleland, where you hear stories of pregnant women whose tummies were slit open and the fetuses ripped out of their bodies, and the soldiers announcing that there will be no dissident in Matabeleland. So they identified all Ndebeles, including fetuses, as being dissidents and as being threats to state security. And as this definition says, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So births of Ndebele children were prevented by the 5th Brigade soldiers. forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This usually happened whereby you'd find the children of these people that were murdered would then be orphaned and they had to be transferred to other homes or taken care of by other people. This convention goes on to impose a general duty on states that are signatories to prevent and to punish genocide. Zimbabwe is a signatory to this convention on genocide. So we now need to talk about, I think I've explained what happened, why it happened, and who was targeted. And now I'm going to move to the people that were affected by this genocide. Well, Burundi are intergenerational. They've affected so many generations that were there during Gukurahundi and generations that are being born now. And I'm sure unless it is addressed, it will affect generations to come. So Gukurahundi affected everyone who was alive in Matabeleland between 1983 and 1987. So regardless of whether these people were harmed in any way, they were affected by the genocide just by witnessing what was happening, the fear that they lived with every day, because they knew that if the Fifth Brigade happened to come into their home, they were probably going to die. So the fear that the people lived with during the time and the trauma of witnessing all those things, the children who saw this happening, all the people in Matabeleland were victims of the genocide. And then if we're going, I'm going to now look at the intergenerational effects, the different generations that were affected and how they were affected. We have the parents. Okay, so the primary victims were the people that were murdered by the Fifth Brigade soldiers, the people that were raped, the people that were tortured, and those that were disappeared. And then the parents of those people that were raped, tortured, murdered, disappeared were so affected by the genocide because they lost their children. And some of them till today are living in the hope that maybe one day their children will walk into the room, because that is the torture that comes with being a parent of a disappeared person. You don't know whether they died or whether they were displaced and moved somewhere else, and they're probably going to turn up one day. So they live with that torture of being parents of disappeared children. The children of those people that were murdered, the children of the women that were raped, the children of the people that were tortured and disappeared are also victims of the genocide. The siblings of the people that were tortured, raped, disappeared, they are all victims of the genocide, and all the descendants of these people. So we have descendants of those people who were alive at the time and some that are being born now, people who witnessed the genocide, the survivors of the genocide, different generations of people that survived the genocide, all being victims of the genocide. So what this has led to is a wounded provinces, rather, because it's different provinces that were affected. The Matabeleland provinces, we have Matabeleland South, we have Matabeleland North, we have Bulawayo, which is now a province on its own, and the Midlands provinces. So in the Midlands provinces, it is even more complicated because it is not only the Ndebeles who were affected by this genocide, it is also the people that were living among the Ndebeles who were spared because of the language that they spoke. So simply because they were Shona, they were living with people who were being murdered every day, but they survived simply because they spoke a particular language. And we have a lot of people living with a lot of guilt and trauma and the guilt from surviving, because you're thinking, I survived simply because I spoke a certain language, but neighbors, intermarriages in the Midlands, especially, where the father would be Shona and mother would be Ndebele, and your mother is killed because of the language that they speak. So this has affected our ethnic relations so badly, because Zimbabwe is now divided into victims of the genocide and people who were not affected by the genocide. And the victims of the genocide are Ndebelés. Those who were not affected by the genocide are Shonas. So we now have animosity between the two ethnicities, simply because one group was targeted, and the other group survived. And what the perpetrators of the genocide have done to further divide these two groups is by hiding behind the ethnicity that was not a victim of the genocide. So the government of Zimbabwe benefits from people thinking that Shona people came to Matabeleland and murdered people, but that is not what happened. Yes, the soldiers were Shona speakers, but it was not Shona people that were attacking people from Matabeleland. So the perpetrators benefit from this because they get to hide behind the whole Shona group. So we need for Zimbabwe to move forward. There has to be an effort to reconcile these two ethnicities that were so divided by the genocide. Peace is important for development, and there has to be an effort to reconcile these groups. There has to be justice committed during the genocide. There has to be truth telling so that people find peace. There has to be redress. I mean, it has to be, what happened must be set right. You'll find that during the genocide, it was soon after independence, and the other provinces that were not affected continued to progress because they were now in a post-independent era. You know, schools were built, hospitals were built, so economically, socially, and politically, the provinces that were not affected were thriving, but the Matabeleland provinces were still in a war zone. They were still in conflict zone. The schools that were there were destroyed by Kukurahundi. The teachers were attacked. So there is need for compensation, and this compensation has to be development centered. Unfortunately, my time has run out, but I had a lot more to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Tandy. That was really comprehensive. There's a lot of questions, so I hope we'll come back and get you through some of the last questions. I'd like to turn now to our last speaker today, Tendai Klo, who works as a transitional justice advocacy specialist for the National Transitional Justice Working Group based in Harare, Zimbabwe. That's a mouthful. Among many things, he holds postgraduate certificates in inclusive gender, in transitional justice, and building resources in democracy, governance, and elections, transitional justice, applied conflict transformation, and community development from the Refugee Law Project in Uganda. He's an international citizen service volunteer, and he has his bachelor's degree in peace and governance from Bandura University in Zimbabwe, centered on political and social economic issues, and a master's in human rights, peace, and development from the Africa University in Zimbabwe as well. Tendai has written and published over 30 articles, and I look forward to his presentation this afternoon. Just pop that into the presentation mode and you can get started.
Thank you so much for that mouthful of an introduction. Yeah, I would like to thank you for also inviting me and also making me part and parcel of this panel. So I would like to say I'm also very interested in learning. I'm a perpetual learner, and I also enjoy learning from other organizations and other individuals on how they have dealt with their own situations and how we intend to deal with them as a continent. So I want to thank my.
Before you get started, can you go into a slide presentation and then we'll be able to see it better?
Okay.
Just do it as, yeah. over here, from the beginning, all the way to the left. There you go.
Okay. So as I was alluding to earlier on, I would like to thank the earlier speakers who also gave an overview of what Africa has been experiencing for so many years at the hands of different people. And currently, we are experiencing dictatorships. We are seeing the death of people at various levels because of some of the experiences that we have had in the past. But something that is really outstanding for me as a researcher and also as a practitioner in transitional justice issues relates to the adoption of institutions and legal instruments of violence after independence. So for Zimbabwe, we managed to adopt draconian laws. So back in the day before independence, we used to have laws such as the Law and Order Maintenance Act, which was known as LOMA, and we also had the Official Secrets Act, which was also known as OSA. Then later on, after independence, we adopted a violent system, which redefined these laws, and they were redefined as POSA and IPA, so the Public Order and Security Act, and also IPA, which also stifled the democratic processes after independence. So we see that there were no substantive institutional and legal reforms after 1980. And we just continued on the trajectory that we had experienced in the pre-colonial era. Then fortunately, Thandekile came in with the description of Kukrahundi. So we see that during Kukrahundi, when it started early January 1982, then it started peaking 1983 up to 1987. We saw that tactics such as torture and abductions were mainly used to intimidate and also silence both the real and the perceived political opponents, which the then ruling party was actually targeting. There were so many processes that were initiated, particularly the Chiamago Commission, which was established between 1983 to 1984, when the international community started making a lot of noise around the issues of the genocide that was happening in Zimbabwe. Then that report, unfortunately, was never released after 1984. And up to date, we don't even know the contents of that report. Then as we proceeded as a country, we say that the tactics of using torture and abduction as an intermediary tactic, they found their way into the 1990s and into the post-2000s, when the opposition and also the civil society became more organized and also more vocal about the processes that were happening in Zimbabwe. Then also since 2000, when it was clear that indeed the ruling party could not suppress any dissenting voices and the creation of the opposition parties and the civil society, we saw that torture also spiked. And it was aimed particularly at the CSOs and also the opposition. Whilst on the other side, the international community was also putting more pressure on government to reform and also respect human rights. So more instances of torture were recorded in 2008 and also at the peak, which was also the peak of politics in Zimbabwe. So various organizations managed to come up with very interesting reports, and approximately 2,000 people were tortured alone in the year 2008 during the election runoff. Then we move fast forward to the November 2017 coup, where we saw that prominent people such as the likes of Professor Jonathan Moyo, Mr. Kasukuere, the likes of Mr. Chipanga, and their families were also exposed to some psychological and also some physical torture, which was not even which hasn't been also spoken about to date. So then when the coup itself, the process itself, the sanitization of the coup occurred, there was a sigh of relief and hope that maybe things would change because of the fall of the long-time serving leader, Robert Mugabe. And we also expected that the new dispensation would also roll out long overdue reforms and constitutional realignments with the domestic laws, but that did not happen. So as we saw that tensions started to increase as we approached the July 2018 elections, incidents of violence and torture were also recorded, but unfortunately, they were never put there out in the open, and we don't really know how many people are affected and how they were affected. Then moving on to the 1 August 2018 elections, when the opposition was also demanding the release of the election results. A lot of people were also beaten up in town. People were killed in broad daylight by the army in the Harare CBD. Then in the aftermath of this 14 January 29 protest, when the president announced the fuel hikes and prices also started going up, we also experienced the deployment of the army and the police in the high density suburbs in places such as Chitungwiza, which is in the southern part of Harare. People were assaulted, but women were raped, and most were mentally and psychologically traumatized, particularly in Harare and Bulawayo. Then when the opposition also announced that they will be rolling out protests due to the deteriorating socioeconomic conditions in August 2019, human rights defenders, workers' union representatives such as the likes of Obed Masaraure, the likes of Tatinda Mombeerara, they were abducted and they were accused by the state that they are actually part and parcel of the people who are trying to destabilize the country. And up to date, no one has been held to account for those incidences. Then during the lockdown recently, we saw that there was also the hashtag 31 July 2020 protest. And many people were accused also of trying to destabilize the country. The likes of Ope Ochungono, that's when they were arrested. The likes of Jacob Garuvume, they were also arrested. We saw even young people like Tawanda Chehiwa also being abducted and also tortured and dumped somewhere in Bulawayo for just saying, we want to see change, we want to see an improvement to our socioeconomic conditions. So when I reflect on these issues, as a person who looks at things as a human rights researcher and also as a transitional justice practitioner, I ask myself this: so what do you see in all this? Basically, I see a divided and a hurt, or a traumatized and a violent nation. Our country resorts to violence very quickly, and we are a very angry nation which cannot basically engage each other and actually find solutions to our issues. Then there's the issue of the lack of justice and accountability since 1980. So since Gukurahundi occurred, we have never had any processes to do with justice and accountability. And there have been deliberate concealment of reports so as to brush off any liability on the part of the state. So we have expected a number of times the release of the Chiamago Commission inquiry. That has not happened. We have even seen in some cases, as you also see when I'm reporting, that there's some denialism or accusations of fake or staged abductions on the part of the state and government on the basis of national security. There are a number of cases where it is obvious that we see that people have been abducted and they've been tortured, but the state outrightly denies any liability and doesn't want to be associated with those issues, or rather they come in and they produce a counter narrative to what we actually have evidence of. Then we also see a pattern in the culture of intimidatory tactics through the use of abductions and torture in Zimbabwe. This has been seen even way before, when Gukurahundi started, when the politics even also became quite tense. And it has been ongoing, and you see that it has become habitual when the state or the government itself feels threatened by its own citizens. Then we also see a trend of re-traumatization of victims. This catch and release of victims and survivors of torture has been also being highlighted over the past few months. For example, the case of Joanna Mamombe, who was abducted in May this year, but she has been released, put in prison, released, and put again in prison and released. So we see that there's this also pattern of the re-traumatization of victims, which the state also imposes on the Zimbabwean populace. We also see the increase in the rule of law and not the rule, in the increase of the rule by law and not the rule of law. So recently, we also have seen in Zimbabwe efforts to adopt the controversial Maintenance of Order and of Public Order Act. And we have also seen, heard in the papers that they are also talking about the patriotic bill. Then just yesterday, Cabinet also adopted some amendments to the criminal law, which will criminalize unsubstantiated claims of torture and abductions. So there's this increase in the use of draconian laws to also silence dissenting voices in Zimbabwe. Then there's also the issue of enablement of torture and abductions in Zimbabwe. We have had a number of times in Zimbabwe when the government itself claims that there's a third force behind the abductions and the torture, and they want to sabotage the government. We all know that the state has the monopoly to use force and actually has access to those instruments of force. And we cannot keep quiet and say, okay, so there's a third force, but yet the government is unable to account for that third force. Then there's a problem as we see it. Then there's a report of, we predominantly record or see abductions which are happening in the urban areas. But my question also would be, what of the rural areas, in areas where we basically do not see, where there are no social media platforms, where there are no smartphones, where there is no TV and etc. So there's also the need for us on our part to be asking ourselves that question, okay? So what is happening in the rural areas? To what extent is the issue of re-traumatization of victims and survivors, the issue of torture, the issue of abductions, to what extent is it happening in areas where we can actually not see and actually monitor as we do in the urban areas? So the next slide is what needs to be done. From a personal perspective, I think Zimbabwe should resist the adoption of draconian laws such as MOPA and the Patriotic Act. Basically, these instruments are meant to close the democratic space, and Zimbabweans as citizens, we need to resist adoption of such laws, which actually contribute to stifling of democratic processes in the country. One outstanding issue in relation to torture in Zimbabwe is also that Zimbabwe itself is not a signatory to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of or punishment. Zimbabwe is not even signed and therefore is not also ratified the treaty. So at international level, Zimbabwe also cannot be held to account for what is happening in the country. So we need to push the government to actually sign and ratify this convention. Then there's the issue of the institutional reforms. I think this needs to happen at all levels. And citizens, I think, have the power to also call for these reforms. Where we talk about reforms in the security sector, where we talk about reforms in the executive and the powers that the executive has. We also talk about institutional reforms in relation to the judiciary, which is also responsible for administering the rule of law in the country. Then there's the important aspect of justice and accountability. Perpetrators should be exposed through naming and shaming and brought to book. So I think what Ndegile was also doing earlier on, naming everyone who was responsible for planning and also rolling out Go Ground is very important, because it also needs to be put in our record books, and we need also to be clear on who was responsible for what. Then there is also the issue of documentation and information sharing on torture. Manfundo, I think, touched a bit on this, that we also need to be documenting our experiences as nations which are also dealing on torture and other issues. Zimbabwe, for example, does not have a centralized system where we can actually say, if we want to talk about torture, where do we find that information? Or the statistics since 1980, where do we find that information? Civil society organizations have this information, but we also need to continue documenting, but at the same time sharing with other strategic players like the UN, the AU, the SADC, CSVR in South Africa, and other platforms where actually people can debate about torture issues across the continent. Then there's also the release of the Chiamago Commission of Inquiry report, which was done between 1983 and 1984. Some of the issues which Tandegile also touched on earlier on are captured in that report. So the release of these reports is also a way of allowing those who have died, is a way of not allowing only those who have died, but also the ones who were there to speak out and tell their story through the reports. Information was captured. The records are there, the data, the statistics are there, but we just need to be able to have access to that report so that we can also substantiate our claims in line with Kukurahundi. Then there's the issue of dialogue on torture. So Manfundo spoke about collective issues. Then there's also the national issues. Then there's also the one-on-one issues. So I suggest that we have a dialogue at national level where we address issues to do with institutions, the leadership, and other things. Then at community level, we also need to talk about how previously issues to do with abductions and torture and other violence have done to communities, so that we can establish how communities have been affected by different epochs of violence. Then there's the aspect of having one-on-one dialogues, where we can actually sit with people who have been affected in the past, and how we can actually have solutions to those issues and establish how deep the trauma goes. Then lastly, there's the issue of the establishment of national and community-based psychosocial support systems. We have seen that mental health systems and processes anyway in Africa, they are very expensive. Rehabilitation processes are very expensive. But if we manage to establish something like the friendship bench, for example, and actually reach communities and actually try to assist them in recovery, in rehabilitation, so that they are also healed, as Manfundo said earlier on, that we are hurt in the heart. So we also need processes which also speak to us and which are also accessible to us, particularly at community level, that will definitely assist us in also healing the nation as we also proceed to actually involve everyone in the process. I think that's all from my side. I would like to thank you.
Excellent, and thank you so much. You are 1 minute within your time, so you did a very good planning on this. We have a number of questions. We understand that we're just coming up on time, but we'd like to see that those who'd like to stay on and get the questions answered by our speakers are more than willing to do it. If you can't, we understand, and that you can then come back and listen to the recording of this later if you want to catch the questions. But I think we're just going to stay on a little bit. If everybody could open up the questions that are there, we could just start going through the questions. We have a valued feedback, a poll. So if you could quickly also, before you do turn off, answer the poll that we've put up and make sure that we get your feedback. And as that's happening, we can actually start with answering some of the questions. Manfundo, I think the first question was for you. It went to answered because we wiggled with it or we jiggled it or something. But the first question is from Kosi, and he or she, I'm not sure, says, thanks for the insightful presentation. There are no African Americans without Africa. Well, Africa is in the epicenter. Where do we place African Americans on this continuum? And what can we learn and teach other from our collective trauma? That's on the answered piece, but if we could go with that one for you, I'll give some other questions to a few of the other folks, and we'll just kind of come and do all the answers together. David Makwere asks, Manfundo and Stephen, thanks for the complex situation we see ourselves in this context and the continent. For Manfundo, what has been your experience with indigenous, and if there are any defined models of trauma healing approaches, and to what extent can they help us out of the paradox of the woundedness? And for Steve, how can Africa insulate itself from the manifestations of neo-imperialistic forces in China and Africa, whose interests, which are covert, are surely to profit from the peaceful-less Africa? We have another one that is for Tandy. Could we also add issues of belonging for children where one of the parents was Shona and Nambili as the intergenerational effects? And another one for Tanda Kelly. Thanks for your detailed account. Your view are the efforts of the government through the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission enough to bring healing to the people of Matabaland and Midlands? What do you think needs to be done to address this dark past? Why don't we start with those questions, and we'll see if there's some more that come in for Tendai in your last presentation. So we'll first go to Manfundo, and you can answer the few questions you've been given. Manfundo, sorry, I keep slaughtering your name.
Manfundo, I've been calling you Angie instead of Angie, so we are even. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your positive feedback. I'm always excited. 20 years ago, it was really difficult to send this message home, but I think really recently, and just with COVID-19, the issue of collective trauma and wounding seems to resonate, and people have a good uptake on it. So for me, that is really, really exciting. I think the first question around the African-American experience and its link, we know that the pain of African-Americans is also very rooted in them being uprooted from their home countries in very violent ways. And a lot of the trauma they experienced was based on racism, and them experience trauma because of the color of their skin, which is something I think that is shared across the globe. So within the collective trauma field, there's a lot of work that is emerging on what is called the Black pain, and really understanding just the centuries of the oppression of Black people and what it takes. I like what Martin Luther King said, and I always talk about it when I talk about what the healing of collective Black pain means. And he says that, our greatest liberation is when at the core of our DNA, we can begin to know our worth. Because the pain of the Black pain was about attacking the very sense of who we are as a people and our worth as human beings. So there's a lot of linkages. Maybe Celeste and her team who have organized this so well, we can do something together with our fellow Black American, African-American brothers to do something that looks at that collective trauma from that angle. But definitely there's lots of linkages, and the trauma of slavery and how it has shaped now the experiences of African-Americans. I think the one on existing approaches, indigenous, I always say this word correctly, I don't say it correctly, approaches and how we can work with them. If I mean Celeste is there, I know that at CSVR they've done amazing work in taking most of the traditional training that we have at universities and use it to align with approaches that are rooted in our African culture, and being able to differentiate between healing approaches and harmful approaches. Because there's always this sense that when we talk about our cultural approaches, people think, oh, it's always harmful. And I mean, just at the top of my head from being a young girl growing up, there's certain learnings, the issue of storytelling. which is really at the core of our culture, which has now been borrowed, of course, by psychology, the importance of being able to tell stories. That is very much rooted in our culture. How do we use that to shape our work? The whole concept of dancing and being connected to our bodies, that has always been at the root of who we are as Africans. And psychology is now waking up to the importance of integrating these. And finally, there's and for me, COVID-19 was really a wake-up call, because I just realized the power of the rituals that we do during grief. We have all these rituals that we do a week before, and because of COVID, we haven't had them, and I've just seen how traumatizing that has been. So we can already learn from these rituals that are already rooted in our approaches, which over and above, once you start psychology and then you go back to how we used to do things, there is so much linkages. We just need to record and write our experiences. It's really sad that we live in the world where things are only acknowledged because they've been written in books. So we need to capture that. But I mean, Celeste and your team at CSVR, our clinical team, I know they've done more work than me in this area. So please also feel free to jump in.
Good. Stephen, did you have an answer for us for the question that I posed to you?
Yeah, hi, Angie. Yeah, I was thinking about it, and unfortunately, I don't have a full answer. And I'm going to leave my email address for everyone. I mean, I think for myself, maybe the two that I have is maybe we need to admit that the neoliberal or the capitalist economic models are not working for us. And we need to try and move away from these type of economic models. A lot of projects and development is seen as huge infrastructure projects rather than maybe more rural development projects that put agriculture first. And maybe my last point is, I think we need more institutions, more spaces in Africa itself that can help with development. So not turning to others outside of Africa for development, but building our own capacity to do development the way that we might want to do it. My email address is there. I see there was another comment addressed to me. You're welcome to get in contact. Thanks.
Tanda Kelly, I'm going to turn to you and Tendai. There's a couple more questions. So there was the first question that I'd posed to you, but there's quite a few questions here on Zimbabwe. Thank you both. One person is asking, are there NGOs supporting reconciliation and healing between the Shona and the Nambile divide? Is there a conversation action within the country around healing to unite people against the current government and its tactics? I have another one who's saying, thank you for talking so honestly about our problems in Zimbabwe. But in addition to the tribal divide, I also feel that the long-held racial lines are not recognized either. We haven't even started to heal the Black people, and I hope we can start soon. I'll leave it with that for the there's one more, sorry, David Makawari again. The colonial state machinery is still in place. The prisons are in a sorry state. The police and the army are probably more brutal than the colonial regime. I agree that community healing is important, but there's a need to deconstruct the current model of state in Zimbabwe and to help the current leaders to heal, because they're also the products of the brutal colonial state. The question is, how do we as Zimbabweans initiate this? So I'll leave that with the two of you to give us your thoughts on those large, very deep questions.
Tendai, do you want to go first?
Tendai, you are muted if you're trying to speak.
Thank you. Thank you. I had switched on the video and forgot to unmute. Thank you. So I work for a platform that was created and is at the moment about 90 organizations which work in transnational justice issues. So we talk about issues of dialogue on dealing with the past. We also have platforms where we also bring together survivors to also share their experiences. And we also have platforms such as radio programs, where we can also bring together various experts, survivors, and other players in transnational justice processes in the country to talk about these difficult issues that confront our country, and also to discuss our violent past and how we think we can move on as a country. I'll be honest and tell you that this is not an easy process. We have tried to at least open up some space for dialogue, but it's not easy at all. So if you want a list of all the organizations, I can make an arrangement that we can share with you our publications, where we have each and every organization in each and every region, which you can also engage and also talk to, so that you can also get involved in our work. Then in terms of, secondly, I think the issue to do with reconstruction of the state and also nation building. I think citizens have a lot to contribute, because citizens are the arbiters of what happened in Zim. People know exactly what happened, and if we strategize, we can actually try to force even the leadership to try to listen to us and also reconstruct the state in such a way which deals with the past and also which promotes the basic human rights of the ordinary citizen. So, for example, previously we did not have the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, but the citizens, through the taking transnational justice to the people program, people demanded that the National Peace and Reconciliation is included in the 2013 Constitution. The Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission previously was not also there, and people pushed that we actually have such an institution which actually speaks to the expectations and the needs of people. So I think it's the issue around organization of people, also people knowing what they want and what they expect from the state and the government, and they actually demand that process, those processes are actually involved in our day-to-day deliberations. And people also put on the agenda clearly what they expect and what they need from the state. So through the national dialogue process, if it happens this year or next year or whenever the case may be, citizens should also be quite clear on what exactly they want and how they expect it to be done. That way, citizens also contribute to nation building and reconstruction of the state. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Tendai. I think I'm going to answer this by saying that there is need for a genuine transitional justice process in Zimbabwe. And the reason why we have never had a genuine transitional justice process is because the perpetrator of all the violences of all the atrocities in Zimbabwe is ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party. So with the perpetrator still at the helm and still in charge of the country, it is very difficult for us to address these injustices, because one of the most important way of addressing this would be to try those people that committed the crimes. And you find that if you look at Ukurahundi and all the other human rights crimes that Tendaisha spoke about, which have happened from 1980 to date, you realize that the only common denominator there is who the perpetrator is. The perpetrator of these violences is ZANU-PF. So, which means the problem that Zimbabwe has right now is that ZANU-PF is in power. They are in power by force, and their method of governance is brutality. So this is the question that Zimbabweans need to address. And once we realize that the problem is the perpetrator and the fact that the perpetrator is still in power. Not only is the perpetrator still in power, the perpetrator is holding on to power by continuing to commit atrocities, because anyone that tries to stand up against the perpetrator becomes a victim of the next atrocity. So Zimbabweans need to come to terms with the fact that we have a government that has to be removed from power. And the methods of removing governments from power are elections most of the time. When elections are disputed, you go to court, but those methods are not available to Zimbabweans. They are not options for Zimbabweans because our elections are rigged and our judiciary is captured. So what that means is we need to then find a way of removing our government, which is not through elections and which is not through court judgments. And the only other method that the Constitution allows us is via peaceful protests. So I believe until Zimbabweans are ready to peacefully protest against the misgovernance that has been happening since 1980, we're going to be stuck with this government. And someone mentioned that we are divided along racial lines as well. We're divided in every way that you can imagine, because what the government is using is divide and rule. So they know that the moment Zimbabweans come together against them, all these injustices are going to stop. So Zimbabweans have to find each other for us to solve this problem.
Good, thank you. You guys addressed really deep and difficult questions there. We have a couple of questions. One question came for us from the Congo, and I'm here looking for it. I don't know, I think it's disappeared. Maybe it's just disappeared. Yes, so Amina has answered you, Rodrigo. He had asked if there wasn't a single Congolese who could have presented Congo's history like the folks from Zimbabwe had. And we said, thanks. There were abstracts that were actually submitted for this conference, and that's what we actually picked up and used. But we'd love to have the voices and other things. I have another person who's actually raised a question about, is there an opportunity for the attendees? So this is a very hard conversation to have with just speakers and not being able to interact. I think, Fidi, you also mentioned that we weren't having interaction as we'd normally have live. And is it possible for over the months that we're at the symposium to have another way for us to begin to interact and share? And we just wanted to know, maybe in the chat line, if there are other people who would also be interested in this. Unfortunately, we're over time, and Stephen and Manfundo have had to actually leave. So a number of the questions that we have, we're not going to be able to get to all the unopened questions. But is there, let me just go through here and check if there's anything else that's still kind of left open so that we can still stay here. NGOs, you'll get to that. Sorry, Manfundo and the wounded leaders, but we'll see what that could be. And if people could just let us know if you're interested and keen in some kind of collective attendee process, just let us know and we can see what that can happen. Yes, there will be we'll send out the links to this whole presentation. So if you missed the first part of it, you'll be able to catch up. And there's a lot of thank yous to the speakers today and the excellent jobs that you've done, and thanks to CSVR for hosting this symposium. I think that brings us all to the few questions with Manfundo, who's already left us, that we won't be able to answer today, but I think that we've got through most of the questions. And I think that means, Celeste, that we can actually bring the symposium or the panel today to a close. And we'd like to thank everybody for this really engaging session. And we look forward to joining again on the 25th of November, where we're going to talk about repetitive cycles, repetitive cycles of violence. And that will be the next topic. So we look forward to everybody joining us at that time. And if there's nothing else, we'd just like to say, have a good evening or a good day wherever in the world you are. And thanks for joining in.